Hello, everyone. The last second I've had to go solo because Chris Uhlmann has run into serious technical problems, which can drive you crazy. I know it's happened to me a couple of times in the last 2 weeks. And when you've got an online event that's looming down on you, it becomes very stressful. So I'm going to start off and maybe with luck, Chris will be able to get patched in pretty soon. So here we go. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming to this Dymocks event. I've never done anything quite like this particular kind of event, so it's good. Welcome, everyone. Let me begin. I'm going to talk for maybe 10 minutes, and in the meantime, if you've got questions you'd like to send along to the moderator, they will, I think, pop up on my screen. And then after I've spoken, I will respond to some of your questions. So away we go. Well, why did I write this book? Well, as you probably know, I wrote a book about the impact of the CCP in Australia called Silent Invasion, which came out a bit over 2 years ago in February 2018, and it had quite a difficult birth. I was suddenly left without a publisher a couple of months before it was due to come out, but it eventually came out thanks to Hardy Grant, who said, "We believe in free speech and we won't be intimidated, so we'll publish this book." And then after 6 to 9 months, after Silent Invasion came out, Hardy Grant said to me, "Clive, this book has been so successful. There's obviously a big hunger for this kind of information. Why don't you do another one on the impact, influence of the Chinese Communist Party in the rest of the world?" And I thought about it for about a day, and I thought, you know what, that's a really good idea. Of course, I thought the rest of the world is just too big and too difficult given its complexity, but I reckon I could do one on the impact of the Chinese Communist Party on the Western world, viz. North America and Western Europe. And so, but I also thought I can't really do this by myself because I don't have the range of expertise. And so I was giving a talk at a think tank, Merix in Berlin, and I caught up for lunch with a couple of experts from Merix, the think tank, one of whom was Marika Olberg. And we had a very interesting conversation, and it occurred to me a day or two later that she would be a fantastic co-author. And so I asked her if she'd be willing to, and she said yes, obviously. And I was very happy with that because Marika has brought to the project of this new book, Hidden Hand, a kind of breadth or extent of knowledge, particularly in Europe, but also, of course, the Chinese language skills and the insights into the functioning of the Chinese Communist Party that only someone with her level of deep expertise and her extended periods of study and work in China, and I believe in Taiwan and Hong Kong, can bring to a project like this. And so we formed a team and off we went. And so we wanted to write this book because we're aware that there's a well-organised and systematic attempt to reshape the world, particularly the Western world, by the Chinese Communist Party, and a great deal of naivety and in some places ignorance about China under the CCP and the way it operates in the West. And so we wanted to collect together from available sources and from some very obscure sources and from some people we knew with expertise and experience, we wanted to collect a whole swathe of evidence on the comprehensive campaign of CCP interference and influence in Western countries, and to put it in a framework for understanding why is the CCP doing this? How does it go about it? What are the techniques it uses? What's the role of the United Front Work Department and the range of other agencies that we in Australia are now starting to become somewhat familiar with, but which are completely foreign to people Less so in North America. There's a bit more awareness there, particularly in Canada. And I've noticed the Hidden Hand, for your information, just a bit of background. It was published in German in May. That was the first edition anywhere in the world. It was due to come out in English all around the world also in early May. But Hardy Grant decided to put it off because of the coronavirus shutdown. But it did come out some 3 weeks ago in Australia. But the publisher in London, which covers the UK and US, decided to put it off until September. But then the publisher in London, One World, had suddenly a media frenzy, which began 10 days ago. And the media frenzy began because one of the organisations discussed in the book, known as the 48 Group Club in London, that organisation and its chairman, a man named Stephen Perry, sent a threatening letter from their lawyers to One World, the publisher in London, saying that the club and its chairman had been defamed, that the book was full of serious errors, and that they demanded various changes and that other things, and we should not go ahead and publish. Anyway, this story got out basically through the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper, and I welcome Chris. Chris has just arrived. Great to see you. Hello, Chris. I hope you've got audio as well as video. I'll just finish my intro and then Chris can lead in with his questions. And so when the British media learned that this group, the 48 Group Club, which we argued with a great deal of evidence is very close to the Chinese Communist Party and acts as a kind of megaphone for it in the United Kingdom, when the British papers learnt that this club was trying to stop publication of the book, they became extremely interested. And there's been a swathe of stories in the newspapers last week, mainly in the Times and the Daily Mail, about the 48 Group Club, about various luminaries who are associated with it, like Michael Heseltine, former Deputy Prime Minister, who tried to topple Margaret Thatcher, like former Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott, nicknamed Two Jags Prescott, and various other people, Tony Blair, Jack Straw, a bunch of other people who apparently had associations with it. And they were basically door-stopping them and saying, why are you associating with this obvious Chinese Communist Party front group? So you can imagine there was a kind of media frenzy which continues. The Daily Mail is going to run very strong and hard on the whole story on this Saturday. So the book in Britain will come out next week. In the United States, it's still delayed for some time. But we are hoping that people who get a chance to read it, and we know already that quite a few people in Australia have been reading it, the book will help to explain to those audiences in English-speaking countries, and indeed French and German and Italian-speaking countries, start to understand the structure and functioning of the Chinese Communist Party. And one test will be in a year's time when I'm talking to a British or a newspaper or an American one or an Italian one, I won't have to explain what the United Front Work Department is. Most people who follow this stuff in Australia now have a bit of an idea of what it is, China's vast influence network, which it mobilises in countries like Australia in order to win friends and influence politics. So that's how the book came about. That gives you a bit of a flavour to the kind of argument. The book, like Silent Invasion, is very, very meticulously referenced and sourced. About a third of the book, footnotes or end notes, plus a glossary and index and various other things to help the reader find their way through it. And of course, the other reason why Marika and I are extremely meticulous in our referencing and giving credible sources is because we want to make sure that we're not subject to any kind of legal claim. And we do know that the Chinese Communist Party and its arsenal of political warfare weapons is known to use lawfare that is, the use of the legal system as a way of silencing and intimidating its critics. So on that note, I might introduce the chair, Chris Uhlmann. And Chris, perhaps you'd like to make some comments and ask some questions.
Yeah, Clive, sorry. And again, technology was defeating me there for a while. I'm on my phone now. But one of the things that I find fascinating about this is that you started that book, Silent Invasion, where you look at influence operations inside Australia. But then essentially when you extended your remit to the rest of the world, you saw a similar pattern emerging everywhere. How is it that the Chinese Communist Party goes about essentially trying to recruit the elites around the world? How do they groom these people?
Well, it's interesting you should use that word, grooming, because it's one that I think we use it once or twice in the book, and I thought about it for a while, whether we should use this word grooming, but it seems to be such an apt word to describe the way the Chinese Communist Party focuses on winning over individuals amongst the political, business, academic and cultural and indeed media elites in Western countries. And when I use the word grooming, I mean the use of psychological techniques to befriend and to establish a rapport with the target person in order to lower their inhibitions and create a sense of reciprocity, opening them up to seeing the world in a way that suits one's interests. And we give quite a few examples in the book. And of course, the grooming techniques are tailored to the target involved. We in Australia are kind of well ahead of everyone else in understanding this process, in large measure because we have benefited from some excellent journalism exposing particular individuals who have been the subject of these grooming techniques. Incidentally, James Jian To, the New Zealand expert on United Front strategies, in his brilliant book called Chow Wu, which actually arose out of his PhD thesis, he got access to some hard-to-access archives in Beijing to write his. He talks about the psychological techniques which United Front cadres are trained to use in order to win over their targets, particularly in the elites. And we saw a very nice example with Sam Dastyari. And Sam Dastyari has done us the favour of, when he saw the light and did his mea culpa, he actually spoke about how he had been groomed by Huang Zhangmo, the kind of techniques of flattery, of being brought into the confidence, of being having his ego boosted, of playing to his weaknesses, and we really benefit from having people like that. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the techniques that they use.
And look, what I love about the book is the level of detail that you go into. There are so many examples from right around the world with the same techniques used. And you can imagine someone like Sam Dastyari is not as sophisticated as someone who might become an ambassador to a country. But you show examples of where the Canadian ambassador and the Swedish ambassador essentially end up not representing their countries, but feeling that their role is to explain China to their countries and to the world.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, I'd been writing and thinking about this, and then along comes John McCallum. John McCallum was a long-term Sinophile, and he'd been appointed by Pierre Trudeau as Canada's ambassador in Beijing. And he loved China and everything about China, and which is, in one way fair enough, but it also makes him extremely vulnerable because he had this sense that he understands China. And this is a dangerous thing. And so what happened was when the Huawei CFO, Huang Mengwanzhou, was arrested in December 2018 on an extradition warrant from the United States, charged with fraud, Beijing went absolutely berserk and we think we're under pressure from Beijing at the moment. Well, it was a lot worse and still is in Canada. They arrested innocent Canadians who are still rotting in jail, and I'm very worried that may well happen to Australians, incidentally. But that's by the by. But John McCallum made a series of public statements along the lines of, first of all, offering in public legal advice to Ms. Meng as to how she could get out of her arrest and avoid the extradition. And then he gave advice to Chinese language media, but of course it was reported by the Star in Vancouver. Joanna Chu was the reporter who was there. He basically gave advice to his bosses that they should just let her go, that it wasn't worth the candle, that it was in Beijing's interest to repudiate its extradition treaty with the United States and just let her go. And Trudeau was forced to sack his ambassador because he was really pressuring Ottawa to do what Beijing wanted it to do, instead of explaining to Ottawa how Beijing operates and how Ottawa can properly respond to it. He was basically acting as a proxy for Beijing, and he was fired as a result. And then there was a fascinating story in one of the newspapers where a journalist went to speak to the Mexican ambassador to Beijing, former Mexican, and he said, I know exactly what happened to John McCallum because they tried it on me and I saw them try it on lots of ambassadors. What they do is when you get there, they put you in the freezer. And as an ambassador, you think, oh my God, I can't do my job. And then after a while, they send an envoy who says, look, a very, very important person wants to meet you because he thinks that you have a unique understanding of China. So you go along very excited. And then the flattery starts. Look, we really need to meet with you because we understand that you have a particularly deep understanding of China. You recognize that very few people can understand China. We want to let you into some of our, inner thoughts. And so he's one. He thinks, okay, I'm now in a special position. I am one of the few people in the world who can explain China, which is so hard to understand. It's so inscrutable that, it's my job to go out to the world, and particularly to my government, and explain the position of the Chinese government and actually advocate for the Chinese government and constantly put the view that, it's hard to understand, it's opaque, I understand it, and we really need to keep Beijing happy. And that's what John McCallum was doing. He'd been groomed, he'd been captured, he was naive, and he became a Beijing mouthpiece. It was tragic in a way, and yet there are many examples around the world, not least in our own Department of Foreign Affairs, where that kind of thing has happened.
Yeah, one of the other things I think that you do is really important is that the party essentially tries to make China equivalent to the party itself. You quote a speech by Xi Jinping where he says, government, military, society, schools, north, south, east and west, the party rules over everything. So what the Chinese Communist Party wants the Chinese people to believe and the world to believe is that the Chinese Communist Party is synonymous with China. And of course, that's a dangerous thing for, well, there's a difference between the people of China and the people of Chinese descent around the world and what it is that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to achieve.
It's absolutely vital distinction. And yet it's a very kind of, it's a very difficult ideological preconception to dislodge. And there are plenty of people in Australia who talk as if this is true. But it's absurd. I mean, if I say the Morrison government is the worst government we've ever had, no one would accuse me of being un-Australian, except perhaps, the Prime Minister's press secretary. But it would be absurd. That's not un-Australian. I'm just criticising the government. But the Chinese Communist Party believes, and there's a substantial portion of the Chinese population that agrees, that the CCP is the embodiment of the Chinese people. It is the representative of China, of Chinese culture, of Chinese history. And of course, the party does everything it can through its vast propaganda campaign at home to reinforce this from kind of day one when a child is born. the images and messages they see all reinforce this message that the party is the protector, the saviour, and the representative of the people. And it's very disturbing that so many people in the West speak as if this is true. And so when someone like me attacks the Chinese Communist Party as an authoritarian party trying to exert its influence in Australia, they accuse me of attacking the Chinese people and therefore of being racist. And everyone who is prominent in exposing the activities and criticising the activities of the Chinese Communist Party will be attacked for being a racist and a xenophobe. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party loves that. I mean, that's exactly what the propaganda message is that they're always trying to promote.
The other thing that you point out too, and we hear this all the time in argument, is a certain kind of deflection. It's what you call a whataboutism. People will say, sure, the Chinese Communist Party might be bad, but what about Donald Trump, who rules the United States just as bad as the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, well, it's actually at one level it's a debating trick. It's a way of trying to deflect attention from the thing you don't want your interlocutor to focus on or win any points on. It's a way of downplaying the Chinese Communist Party repression, of shifting the grounds of the discussion. And it's interesting, because I was talking to someone I know well who's a marriage counsellor, and I was telling her about whataboutism and how in the China debate in Australia, there are all kinds of people, mostly on the left of politics, who, when China comes up, or CCP, they'll say, yeah, well, what about the United States? And this person, the marriage counsellor, said to me, yeah, I know all about that. I'll have a pair of people arguing or having a discussion in the counselling room about, let's say, their inability to resolve issues to do with finance, common problem in marriage. And you'll get more and more intense. And then someone will say, well, what about you never wash up, you never make the bed, you're always late, so it's kind of a way of deflecting. And the answer to that is, well, we can talk about that later on, but at the moment we're talking about finance. And so I'll say the same thing. Very happy to have an argument about, or a discussion about, the United States and its role throughout the world. And you know what? I probably agree with you mostly. But now we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. So let's talk about that. And so it's I'm very intolerant, actually, of this constant debate. You could say, well, what about the Soviet Union? What about anything? What about any other dictatorial power in history? But no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. So let's focus on that. And some people say to me, well, I hope you're going to write a book about the influence of the United States next. And, I say, well, look, I've been around for quite a long time and I've had a lot to say about the United States. Do I have to focus only on that, or are we actually allowed to talk about what is, I would argue, a far more serious threat to world stability and world peace?
I should indicate that we want to take questions from people now, and I'm not quite sure, Tim, since the technical problems we have at the outset, how they appear. So and if there's no other way, then send me text messages because I can get them on my iPad. But one of the things, so I invite those questions now, and would like as many as we possibly can get to, Clive. But one of the other things that you hear all the time, and is again, I've covered off in your book, are these claims that China does not seek empire. China is unique in history as a great power that only desires peace. What do you make of those claims, given what we're seeing around the world right now?
Well, first of all, I'd ask those people to just nip over to Hong Kong and chat to the people over there about whether the China under the CCP only seeks peace and harmony, and perhaps then they might go over to Tibet and talk to the Tibetans about that, and maybe they could go do a third leg of the trip and go to Taiwan and ask them whether they think China under the CCP is a peaceful country that is no threat to anyone. But beyond that, the Chinese Communist Party adopts a kind of principle that goes way back, summarized in the Chinese phrase Wu Wei, which means it's best to have two kinds of power: military power and what the Chinese Communist Party calls discourse power, which really means winning the battle of ideas. And the Chinese Communist Party puts enormous emphasis on winning the battle of ideas. And if we were talking about influence operations and grooming, that's what it is. It's all about thought management, winning the ideological battle. And the party sees itself as engaged in a life or death ideological struggle with the West. And so the strategists of the CCP often argue internally that the United States, by its military adventurism, and you don't have to go back any further than Iraq, but you can go back a lot further if you choose, has been massively costly, massively damaging to the United States in all kinds of ways, including financially. And the last thing they want to do is ever to repeat that kind of mistake. So they will always try to win, that is, to become the hegemonic dominant power through means other than conventional warfare. They don't want to start firing guns. They want to have a big military. So the threat of firing guns is always there. And let's face it, they've been flying fighter planes and bombers around the island of Taiwan in a very threatening way in recent times. And so that, they definitely have a different strategy, but it means only that they're a hegemon in a different kind of way, or an aspiring hegemon in a different kind of way.
All right, Clive, I'm told that some of these questions might pop up on your screen, but I have one in front of me now. In Hidden Hand, you talk a lot of discourse power, discourse control. Can you explain why that's important to the Communist Party and what the aims are?
Yeah, look, this is a great question. Thanks for that. And I mean, in a way, it's the most important theme of the book. And I have to say that, compared to where my thinking was at when Silent Invasion was published, this is probably the area of my understanding that has advanced most since. And it's been heavily influenced by working with Mareike Olberg, whose area of specialization is in fact in the Chinese Communist Party's external propaganda system. So discourse control or discourse power is really, and they're terms that the party itself uses, and it's really all about shaping the narrative externally. And it occurs in the context of propaganda work and thought work, as they call it, which is carried out, and the main domains in which it's carried out are in the public through the media of various kinds, massive effort into media work in around the world, particularly under Xi Jinping, in universities, in think tanks. We did quite a lot of work on CCP influence on think tanks in Western countries, and it's much more extensive than you might think, or that many think tanks would like to admit. And also they very much target opinion makers wherever they may be in the Western world, including, as I showed in Silent Invasion, targeting Western journalists on all expenses paid chaperone tours to China, where even some hard-bitten journalists somehow managed to shift their opinion and come home and write flattering stories about the CCP regime. So discourse power is very important, and some CCP theorists, they've studied Foucault because of the pioneering work that Foucault and his co-workers did on discourse and what it means, and that really ultimately power is about the capacity to shape discourse, the narrative, effectively the way people think, which if you think of 1984, that's exactly what Orwell was writing about. And so we go into a great deal of detail. In fact, arguably almost all of the book is about, one way or another, about discourse control and the way in which the CCP has set out to reshape the discourse abroad. That is the way people think about China, about the Chinese Communist Party, and China's place in the world, and as a way of reducing the ideological threat that the party sees to its own power base.
Well, mate, I don't know if you're seeing any questions in front of you, but if not, I have a second. At one
Please,
point, yeah, I've got a question for Clive here in front of me. Do you see parallels between the US imperialism in Latin America and China's relationship with Australia? Subtext, I don't know if you get all the rest of that, but that's the first half of the question I can see, Clive.
When I think back to the way the United States used to behave in Latin America, in particular in the 50s and 60s, which was, after all, the era of the banana republic, and a banana republic was a republic built around one commodity, which gave enormous power to a very narrow elite, and that elite was easily won over to the United States and became, as the lingo was then, compradors. And I think there is, I think actually the Chinese Communist Party is far more subtle than that, because the US methods in Latin America were really rather crude and brutal. It was guns and money, bottom line. Whereas the CCP definitely uses money. Sam Dastyari can tell you all about that. And there's a much bigger story there about the business community, of course. But they use these far more subtle psychological techniques, and they aim much more broadly across all of the elites who can have an influence not just on policy but on ideas. And so, the US did some work in the 50s, 60s, 70s in Europe, for example, through its intellectual work. What was the magazine that they secretly funded? I forget the name of it, which set out to publish anti-Soviet ideas quite effectively in some respects. But really the CCP is doing what somebody called a full court press in the ideological sphere, where ideology is understood far more broadly, and therefore it's a much more subtle beast to understand and a much more subtle thing to respond to, because you don't really know what you're trying to grab and get hold of. And there are a lot of people who put forward a whole bunch of arguments about how we should relate to China, and often they don't mean the CCP. They just talk China. They never mention the party, which is always an alarm bell. If people talk about China and never mention the party, as a lot of experts do, you know that they're avoiding something. But there are so many people in Australia and elsewhere who are experts and will go on the radio and write articles and so on, that are actually making arguments about China and how we should respond to it that play beautifully into the hands of the CCP, but are deeply offended if anyone suggests that they've been won over or they're actually playing part of an ideological game that they're unaware of. And so that's part of the beauty of it. It's often hard to put your finger on, to call out, and that many of those who have been captured are, of course, completely unaware of it, whereas the US system was much more crude than that.
Right, Clive, another one. At one point in the book, you write about Joseph Nye and soft power in Communist Party thinking. Could you explain that?
Yeah, this is really fascinating, because Joseph Nye came out, Soft Power, in 1990. And the initial reaction of CCP, its media and the theorists, was they saw it as a big threat. They thought, this is really a kind of book about the way in which the United States is infiltrating Western ideas into China. And this was regarded as the parties as extremely threatening. Let's not forget the infamous document number 9 that was circulated within the party. I think it was around about 2005, secret document that made its way into the light, that defined 7 false ideological trends that were to be purged and which were punishable should anyone advocate them. And their false ideological trends were Western constitutional democracy, the notions of civil society and the idea of universal values, Western principles of journalism and so on. Journalists are expected to practice Marxist values of journalism. These ideological trends are opposed by the kind of soft power, and the epitome of it is Hollywood, promoting American values. And but then a year or two later, and incidentally, a translation of certain sections of soft power was rushed out by a military press so that the Chinese theorists and military experts could understand what the US was up to. And then people started to argue, no, well, hang on a sec. If we turn this around, this is something that we really want to do. Although, as we point out in the book, the CCP understanding of soft power is much more focused on the power part of it than the soft part of it. And the last point I'd make in this comment is that China under the CCP has very little soft power. I mean, the CCP puts an enormous effort into the export and promotion of Chinese culture, which it always twists in a way so that it becomes really red culture. The interpretation of Confucianism, for example, the way in which, as we explain in the book, the CCP takes over and guides cultural societies in the West, like the Qipao or Cheongsam societies, or writers' organizations in the West for Chinese writers. And so he doesn't have much soft power by using traditional Chinese culture, but it has very effectively undermined and eroded the power of American soft power. And of course, the most obvious example of this is Hollywood, where Hollywood producers and directors and script writers nowadays, right from day one, when they're considering a new movie, sit down and they think, how can we avoid angering the censors in Beijing, because that's where half of our market is. Okay, and so Hollywood is censored.
All right, Clive, Mariella wants to know, what do you think of China purchasing and owning our agricultural land, dairy farms, water, and even our residential properties?
Sorry, Chris, you dropped out a bit there.
Mariella wants to know what you think about China purchasing and owning our agricultural land, dairy farms, water, even our residential properties.
Well, some people say that we shouldn't treat investment from China any differently to the way we treat investment from Japan or the United States or Italy or wherever. And I actually don't believe that's true, that we should regard investments from China differently. And the reason for this is that China is run by a Leninist party state that has very heavy control, if it chooses to exercise it, over every Chinese company operating abroad. In fact, 2 years ago, the National Congress passed a law which mandated that every Chinese company, and indeed every Chinese citizen abroad, must obey any directive it receives from China's intelligence services. So that means if the CCP or China's intelligence services decide that a company in Australia that owns agricultural land or water rights or electricity infrastructure or telecommunications equipment, if they decide to give it an instruction to interfere, to undertake influence operations, to spy or whatever, then they have to do it. So when the Huawei executives say, we would never do that, if we were asked to hand over information to the government, we wouldn't do it. I mean, this is laughable. I mean, if they said, no, we're not going to do it, they would be in jail. And then the next executive at Huawei would hand it over. They have to do it. And so that's why we need to be far more vigilant about the kinds of investors that come here from China and do far more careful due diligence. We know, for instance, that every medium-sized and large company has a Communist Party cell in it. And the secretary of the Communist Party cell is the most powerful person in the company. In fact, frequently, the chairman of the board of the company and the secretary of the Communist Party cell are the same people. And Xi Jinping has urged companies to do that so there isn't any conflict between the commercial interests of the company and the political interests of the party.
Well, I don't know if I can see all of these questions at the moment, except that Bella wants to know, and I can read part of it. What are your thoughts on how the Australian government should approach China's increasingly hostile narrative of Australia?
Yeah, very, very good question that many of us are grappling with, and none more so than, I guess, the foreign minister and her advisors. Clearly, Beijing is extremely unhappy with Australia. One of the interesting things is that when Maurice Payne called for an international independent inquiry into the origins of COVID, Beijing was extremely unhappy and the ambassador made all kinds of threats. Then the rest of the world said, yeah, we think there should be. And the World Health Assembly unanimously passed a resolution to have an inquiry. Whether that will be an independent inquiry that will produce the truth is another question, because now Beijing is already interfering in it, but that's another question. But after that, it happened, right? Problem gone. They ramped up the pressure. So what do they want? Why were they restricting barley and beef and threatening coal and wine and blueberries, and why were they telling citizens of China, potential students and tourists, don't go to Australia because it's such a racist country, you're liable to get beaten up in the street? And it was because I mean, the only explanation I think is to send a very powerful warning. You stepped out of line, Australia, and you must suffer the consequences. And the hope, and this is a deliberate strategy that CCP has used all of the time between countries and within countries, between companies, for example. They want other middle level and small nations to be looking at Australia and saying, boy, that's bad. I hope that doesn't happen to us. So it's a part of our strategy of intimidation. And I think the Morrison government is handling this very, very well. And because, there are only two options. You capitulate, and then you basically lost your national sovereignty, or you decide not to capitulate. And then if you do that, the only sensible way to do it is to firmly state that these are very important principles, that we don't allow foreign powers to interfere in our decision-making, and you state it firmly but calmly, and you hold your ground and just take the pain, however much pain might come.
Yeah, Clive, one I think you know a lot about. Franco wants to know, is the CCP impacting on curriculum delivery in tertiary institutions? How real is this? How do we guard against this?
Well, we know about the influence of the Confucius Institutes in their... I think there's a kind of subtle way in which Confucius Institutes influence curriculum, and that is the way in which university executives take it upon themselves that the view that they ought not to do anything that's going to anger Beijing. And this is rife across the top levels of our universities. It's not that they don't say it, they don't talk about it. It's just there in the back of their heads all of the time. That if we do that, we might get this bad consequence from Beijing or its proxies or agents or agencies. And so they're careful. And that means that there's a lot of subtle pressure put on academics not to do anything, write anything, say anything, even in tutorials that might anger patriotic Chinese students who might report it to the consulate, and with the consul general explaining bitterly to the vice-chancellor, who's probably a good friend, and the university having to grovel and explain. And so, there's this kind of veil that has fallen over many universities, whereby, I've spoken to lots of academics who say, we know that if we step out of line and attack China or criticise the CCP, we, in our jobs, in my university, we are going to suffer. We are going to come under a lot of heat. And perhaps the most egregious example of the kind of obvious one of how this works is that the University of Queensland last year introduced a new course. I think it's called Econ 3208. I was looking at it the other day. And it's China studies, right? It's not economics, but it's in third year economics. It's nothing analytical. It's purely descriptive. The course content was developed in collaboration with the Confucius Institute, and it's basically apologetics for the CCP. And there are some academics at the University of Queensland who are just absolutely appalled that a foreign government, through the Confucius Institute, should be writing a curriculum and putting on a course in their third year economics program, which is effectively apologetics for the foreign power. How can this happen? When this was pointed out, the university said, oh, well, yes, well, you know, we're going to give the money back. But the course is still there. I mean, how can this even happen in an Australian university? But it's happening.
All right. Time is flying. We're around about 8 minutes at the top of the clock, and I apologise again for us starting a little late because of technical problems that I was having. Ross asks, will Belt and Road projects in Victoria be built by Chinese guest workers rather than Victorians? And I should say, Ross, and to others, you should read a great new fiction book by Heather Rose called Bruni, which is about something very similar happening in Tasmania. Clive, what's your view on that?
Well, certainly the chapter, China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, has provisions in it which makes it much easier for Chinese companies operating in Australia to bring in Chinese workers. And the trade union movement opposed those provisions, but was defeated. And there were people within the Labor Party who often speak in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, who were very vigorous in opposing the trade union movement in their concerns about the impact of the importation of these workers on Australian labour conditions and Australian workers. So yes, it's certainly a lot easier under the provisions of CHAFTA, and certainly with the Andrews government having signed up to the BRI, and now has an obligation, you know, to basically to keep Beijing happy. That's what the BRI is all about. It's discourse power. Trade and investment is just sort of superficial part of the BRI, and it's worth reading what we say about the Italian BRI for this, to understand that the BRI is about discourse power. In fact, we found, this is Marika's work in particular in the book, that the party theorists in the party journals and the party leaders in their speeches to cadres, they say this about the BRI. One of them said, one party leader said that the BRI is an essential part of the assertion of our discourse power around the world. And so now that the Andrews government has been kind of brought into this web of networks, this massive influence operation which the BRI represents, in order to repudiate it or make a decision that China really wanted for some kind of investment or something in Victoria, to go against that would be a massive step for Daniel Andrews personally himself, because he would believe himself to be betraying his friends, his interlocutors, the people who signed the agreements, all the expectations, the reciprocal arrangements that they've all set up, this kind of network of expectations and reciprocity. And so he's captured. And that's why I think it was such a huge mistake for the Andrews government to sign up to it, and why, when you look at why he did, you can see, going back to around about 2012-13, a program whereby he, Daniel Andrews, was gradually groomed so that when the proposal was put to him to sign this BRI, he thought it was a good idea.
Right, Clive, Ed wants to know, are there other authors that you recommend for understanding Chinese government interference?
The first book that comes to mind is a book called Claws of the Panda by Jonathan Manthorpe, a Canadian journalist, who particularly in the second half of his book talks a lot about CCP influence in Canada. There's also a very important long paper by Anne-Marie Brady, the New Zealand sinologist, a paper which you can download. It's called Magic Weapons, very important and influential paper. And there are a couple of reports out of the US Congressional China Committee, Economic and Social Committee on China, which are useful. But basically, Silent Invasion and Hidden Hand are the only book-length treatments of... I should also add James Jian To's PhD thesis, which became a book. It's called Chiao Wu, Q-U-A-O-W-U. Brilliant book. Hard to get though. They're really the best sources. And what I point out is that there are hundreds of books about China and the United States and clash of civilizations and the battle to come and so on and so forth. One thing that is unique about the books and reports I've just mentioned is that they're not really concerned with those kind of external clashes, which strategic policy advisors and so on talk about. What we're really interested in, which we think is actually far more important, is the internal process of influence, infiltration, and subversion that the CCP undertakes. In other words, its essential strategy is to erode resistance to it from within. And so that's what our books are about. And that's why there's so little work on it, because not many people yet understand that that's how the CCP works.
Well, we're going to leave it there, Clive, but can I say that I know this for a fact, and having watched your first work unfold in Silent Invasion and through this one too, and having spoken to diplomats around the world, there are many of them who believe that it was Australia, essentially, that sounded the alarm for the rest of the world through the work that journalists and people like yourself are doing here, and that it has been enormously important. So, look, and I take the time to thank you for everything that you have done, because a certain amount of courage is involved in this work as well. It's not just the problems that you have in trying to get this information, but it's also in trying to publish this information. And you've been through a bitter road on that one with Australia's horrendous defamation laws. But look, thank you so much, mate. We're more power to you. All I can say is that buy this book, read this book. This is an important book, and Clive has been instrumental, basically, in helping to alert the world, not just to Australia, as to what is really the shape of our future if we leave it unattended. So thanks, Clive.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. And thanks, Dymocks.
Yep, thanks very much. Go buy the book.